believers, non-believers, sort of believers, think I'm a believers, and especially today you disaffected believers, welcome. My non-university unstudents and my dear monthly pledging ungraduates, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. Yes, it's good to have you with me today, my unlistening listeners here at the Uncensored Unprofessor. I have a special guest with me today. My son John is joining me. John took a religion degree in college, and he and I and our whole family talk about our Christian faith and talk through what it means to follow Jesus Christ, just as fairly standard conversation matters. And so we've been talking together for years and years about church and church life and following the Lord. And John's been listening to my series on why is the church sick, and I thought, you know what, would be good to have just a running conversation with him. And I know that generationally some of you will resonate with his questions and his concerns. So John, it's great to have you today on the Uncensored Unprofessor. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Good to be on. I've been listening to the show during work, like a lot of people probably do. And I guess I'd just say I feel like a chord got struck with this series on the church. I'm 30 now, and I guess I'll just quickly describe where I'm coming from. So the short of it is I grew up, went to college, kind of figuring I'd be a pastor, and ended up not. I graduated college. I spent 4 years working for a nonprofit called Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and realized that I couldn't do this longer for both emotional and financial reasons. Yeah, and now I find myself in the corporate world, which is great, but I've spent the last 10 years or so now, post-college, kind of mulling over and processing my Christian experience and what it's been like trying to be a part of a church, find a church, especially now that I've moved a few times, and it's good to get to articulate and tease these questions out with you since you're processing all this for your listeners.
Right, and I'm happy to have your perspective. And again, I just want to say to my listeners, I'm not trying to destroy the church or ruin the church. I'm not picking on any one church. I'm saying introspection is healthy. It's a healthy thing personally in our lives to stop and say, hey, is this the path I want to be on? Businesses do this all the time where they stop and ask themselves, hey, is this working? Why do we have a leak over there? Why do we have a short stop here? Why is there failure in this area? So I'm saying, hey, it's okay if the church stops and asks ourselves, why are things not working? Why is Gallup poll telling us that people are leaving the church, that church membership is way down after decades and decades of American church involvement? And so again, John, I'm glad to have your perspective here today. What would you say is a first concern of yours?
That is hard to just have a first, and the reason is I've been contemplating and trying to understand and process my church experience for so many years, and it feels like my takeaways at this point are all really connected. I think if I were to say one, my first would be that the church is not designed, or does the low church, the topic of this series at least, is not concern itself or really design itself around caring for mature Christians. So like in our conversations, I've been saying the 50-year Christian. So on like one extreme, you could have a church that cares mostly about converting non-Christians to Christians, getting new members. And the way I see that is if that's your number one priority, that's the metric for all your success is new people in the seats. You end up having a church, and I was trying to think of an analogy. It's like if you open up a gym and all the maximum weight in the gym is like 10 pounds. It's like, that's great for everyone who's never worked out before. But after about a few weeks or a year, that's no longer enough to sustain and mature you to where you should be over the course of the rest of your life. So I feel that impacts the church in all sorts of ways from there.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I like that. None of us wants to be stuck at beginner weightlifting class, even though when I work out, it seems like I get headaches throughout my neck and head with the little weightlifting I do, push-ups that I do. But yeah, we want to keep getting stronger. We want to keep having things that grow us and challenge us and engage us that help us to move forward. So in your mind, is this just a matter of young churches versus old churches? Like you mentioned, a 50-year-old believer. So are you saying that there should be, for old people there's hymns and for young people there's choruses? Because I think that's the common stereotype. Like we need to have whole different styles for different ages or different levels of maturity.
I'm really glad you said that. I think that can be kind of a way to write off critiques of the church, is that it's like an old person thing. I'm standing here as a 30-year-old with lots of friends my age who can sympathize with what I'm saying, and it's what kind of songs and the volume of the music is important, but I don't even think that's my first concern. I think that's far from my first critique of what's going on, or what we could call like what's wrong with the low church. The first thing that comes to my mind is teaching, actually, as far as addressing both the new believer, the non-believer, and the 50-year-old Christian.
Okay, yeah, good, because that's something I've tried to press on my own theology students for years, is have something there in your sermon for the uninitiated, have something there for people who are starting to dig their roots down deeper, but then have a slab of meat, have a slice of meat there that the people who've been following Christ for decades can stop and ponder, and that the Holy Spirit can challenge them with. So, yeah, I like that. I think there's room for diversity inside the sermon itself. And I'm happy to know you don't think this is just a young person, old person thing. The deal is, you guys, someday you're all going to be 50. The deal is, you guys, someday you're going to look back and you're going to have been following the Lord for 25 years. And I think it's fair to ask, do I want to be where I am now in 25 years? Do I only want to be who I am today 25 years from now? Or do I want to have grown? Do I want to have deepened my walk, richened my walk, beautified my walk with Christ?
Yeah, absolutely. And the goal is not just to get to heaven, right? And I think a lot of new Christians have that perspective, and it's the church's fault if anyone thinks that way about the purpose of Christianity and a relationship with God is to not go to hell. When in fact, the whole point of being a Christian is becoming like Christ and learning how to be responsible for other people, to literally change the world, as cliche as that is, to be people who can be trusted with power and wealth and prestige, but be godly in our ability to handle those things.
Good, because I don't want to go to hell, and I want lots of money. So I'm happy that I'm happy that you're going in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's obviously a tension there, right? Because you could have one person in your seats who thinks that they don't want to go to hell. They also don't want to go play harps in the sky, and that's about their understanding of theology. And you have another person who's been a Christian for 50 years, and you got to speak to both those people. And that goes back to teaching and how hard it is to be a good teacher. And I'm sympathetic to how hard it is to be a good teacher because I've taught and preached. But the part of the reason, and I guess I'll back up a little bit, over the last few years of moving around from California to different parts of Idaho, trying to find a church to take my family to. Almost, I'm going to oversimplify it here to make the point, but I've almost found myself the churches we've gone to, and now the one we're at, just going to the place where the pastor took his preaching the most seriously, if I can say that. In this case, I ended up being at a church with a guy who's actually trained and viewed preaching as a skill to be cultivated and worthy of hard work and even financial investment to be improved at, as opposed to I think a common low church perspective of preaching is someone who's charismatic and passionate, and you find out they're a decent enough person, you kind of can run them up there, and we're all better off just hearing, whatever that person has to say that day. That's obviously an exaggeration, but I think it makes the point of the contrast between viewing preaching as a skill that is worthy of practice and hard work versus, trusting someone based on their charisma and character alone.
Great. I love that nuance. I think, even as I think through like the history of education, back in the medieval era, or back 75 years ago and back, rhetoric was understood to be an important field for study. Today, we say the word rhetoric, and we're only cynical about it. We tend to think, well, rhetoric means someone's manipulating me, or rhetoric means someone's being disingenuous. But the whole art of speaking, the whole skill of speaking, is something that we need to realize has tremendous power over people. I mean, we're all shaped by media. We're all shaped by words. Jesus was a Jew, and the Jewish culture for 3,000 years has been aware of the power of words. And so that's good. I like that you think the emphasis, there could be more emphasis upon the skill of it. But when you say that, do you just mean like the cadence of their tempo or their vocabulary, or what do you mean when you say that there's a skill involved here?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I mean, I really mean skill in every sense: cadence, word choice, humor, and then the ability to speak to people's emotions and hearts and souls, as well as teach the truth of the scriptures. I mean, if you're a preacher, you have, I think, an insanely hard job because, number one, and this is extremely important to be effective, you need to keep people's attention. Like, there's definitely a place for humor and script if you need it. Story and narrative to grab people's attention and their interest. And that's, Jesus does that in all sorts of amazing ways in the scriptures, partially just by being super provocative, but that might be another topic. So just your ability to orate, to talk well in front of people, and then from there to lead them, based on the Holy Spirit, where let them know what God has for them. And there's kind of I know when I was training at school how to be a preacher and stuff, there's kind of two ways to look at it, again, in an exaggeration to make the point. One is that I'll get up there and the Holy Spirit will work through me and what he wants will happen. But the other side of it is, well, why wouldn't the Holy Spirit be working in you in the 12 hours throughout the week that you are preparing and pouring yourself into the writing of this sermon?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I grew up in the Pentecostal tradition, and there's a big emphasis upon being led by the Holy Spirit, and I certainly don't want to deny that. But it would be common in our parlay to say, well, the Holy Spirit can speak through the jawbone of an ass. And I used to say to my students, well, the Holy Spirit can speak through the jawbone of an ass, but I'll bet he wants to work through a sharp knife. He can use a dull knife. He can bludgeon people with the jawbone of an ass. But I'll bet the Holy Spirit likes to work through people who've honed their skills and sharpened their knife. I wouldn't want a surgeon. I had major back surgery 16 months ago. Praise you, living God, for my recovery. I wouldn't want that doctor to either have had that surgery be his first, or him do that surgery unassisted the first time, or him try to do that surgery without having studied vertebrae and spinal tissue and the like. So we want skilled practitioners, and we need the same in the church. I'm just thinking, John, you were a Fellowship of Christian Athletes, was it regional director? Yeah. So how did you go about addressing the kids? Because you certainly had to do some public speaking.
Oh man, that's such a it brings back memories, because it's now been a while since I was in that space doing that. I mean, FCA is a little different as far as the purpose compared to a church. If you're speaking for Fellowship of Christian Athletes, you're speaking at a high school during lunchtime. You truly don't know who's in the room, because you can imagine a high school lunch, the gamut of people that would be there. I mean, that in that context, high energy, lots of good stories to connect, because you're going to have a disproportionately high amount of unchurched kids in there. FCA is expressly, and now it's funny because we're talking about how a preacher can hit both the new Christian and the seasoned one. FCA is expressly focused on unchurched kids. I had this story of I had a guy come in and talk. This local awesome surfer dude told this amazing testimony, and then we later got an anonymous letter from a girl who had written her suicide note that morning and was going to take her life at the end of lunch, and she came in and heard the story and gave her life to Christ. And so that's the kind of context you're working with FCA. So it definitely changes the way that you want to construct your message.
Words are powerful. Thank God that he was there that day, that you invited him, and that girl's life turned in a different direction. That's the power of words. So rhetorical skill. I remember when I was a youth pastor, my wife Tanya, God bless her, would sit there and count how many times I said, what do I want to say is, and at the end of the service, we'd be riding home in the car, and she'd say, well, you said 14 ums tonight. And I had to consciously learn to stop saying So good. And a sense that preaching is a responsibility and a privilege and a skill and something to be invested in, something that can offer the mature believer consideration and meat and savory, tasty menu. When you look at the contemporary low church, what other kinds of concerns do you have that are noteworthy?
I feel like, and we were talking about this a little bit last night, I feel like the church doesn't have this low church that we have and I just want to, we keep using that term, and I know you've defined it and through this series, but non-denominational churches, again, not affiliated with big denominations or anything.
No priests, no sacraments, no liturgical calendar. Low churches have pastors and tend to pay more attention to the secular calendar and have ordinances, but not sacraments, and it's just a different sociological model, different structural model, right?
Yeah, good. You can define it much better than I can. I feel like the church, these churches feel I don't want to say catastrophe, but the urgency of the situation. They hear the same statistics as us regarding the youth not returning to church and people leaving the church. And now a new statistic that you brought up, how there has been a boom in church, with the new model of, that everyone has the same type of band, plays the same type of song, same type of lighting. But those people that have been coming to church have been leaving. Will you just clarify that real quick? I can't remember the stat or how you articulated that.
Well, Gallup poll just a couple weeks ago came out with a new study that shows church membership is down. I was just in a conversation with some friends that typify this, and they are our age, so that means they're right around 85, right? But they were saying that they can't go to church anymore. It's the same thing they've heard all their life. It's playing to the converts. It's playing to the new people. It's high energy. It's not contemplative. It's not investing in people who have been following Christ for 3, 4, 5 decades. It's totally geared toward the uninitiate, and it just feels really, really shallow and thin. And this was my friends saying why they have a hard time going to church anymore. So that anecdotally makes the point that Gallup is saying is we have this growing demo of nuns, NONESs, who they're no longer Baptists, they're no longer Presbyterians, they're Christians, they're just not going anymore. They've said nope, no more church for me.
Yeah, and that's well put. I think the church feels that, and my view of it, the way I feel when I, based on the last several years of finding and visiting all these new churches and winding up somewhere, is that there's kind of this desperation in response, like an attempt to answer the problem of people not coming and people not coming back with programs and trying to find means of what are the key performance indicators, KPIs, to show that we are doing good. And if we can focus on these numbers, donations, baptisms, amount of people in the seats, percent of the parking lot filled up, then we are doing good. When that is never what the church has been about historically. It's never been about that. Now, granted, times have changed. The church has never been more, well, I don't want to say never. That's certainly not true. But at least in the last 100 years, the church hasn't been more scorned and ridiculed than it is now. I don't think it's ever been taken less seriously. Part of that is just the movement of culture, Lord Zeitgeist, as you call it. Part of that's the church's fault as well. And I think this desperation to programize and come up with figures to measure health with have really crippled the church. And again, both made people not want to go and made the people over there not want to come back.
And it makes me feel bad for the pastors because they're kind of in a bind here. They got to pay for the bills. They got to pay the bills. They want things to grow. They want people to have a great experience. They want people to like it. But it ends up causing them to take their eye off the ball and to start focusing on minors instead of majors. In our conversation last night, thinking about KPIs, you mentioned small groups, and you have a concern that small groups serve as a KPI. Tell me what you meant along those lines.
Man, I'm going to try to not get too fired up about this. It's important to say that before I moved to Idaho, I was a part of like such an amazing church in Huntington Beach. I had an experience there. I think a lot of Christians hopefully a lot have had an experience where they had this close to idyllic experience that they now compare other churches to, for better or worse. But even at that amazing church, we did, and they still have small groups. And the thing that drives me crazy about small groups is you're trying to programize and measure the most immeasurable thing, which is community and relationship. Like it's very rare to have actual deep friends in my experience. And again, it's important to say, my views on this are entirely from experience and everyone I talk to and rub shoulders with. I just don't know anyone who has people they consider their best friends being from their small group they went to. Now, people have great relationships in their small groups. I'm still friends with people that I was in a small group in. But it has this it's like, how do I put it? There are things you can programize, like events to go and give to the homeless or something, or building campaigns to raise funds for something. But as far as developing relationship in a church, I feel like it's a square peg in a round hole, so to speak. And it's really tempting for churches, and this kind of goes back to issues with the model. I feel like so many churches just they're kind of like the problem that modern day corporations have. They just believe in eternal growth, and it's not about reaching just a healthy, sustainable state of being. It's about constantly growing, and if you're not growing, then that's a problem. You can see that across all these top companies in the stock market and stuff. They're not concerned with just reaching a healthy state of being. They just need to grow incessantly, which is impossible. And churches answer that pressure, I feel, by putting a lot of emphasis on small groups, this way to measure their community. This is how many we have. This is how often they meet, etc.
So we want authentic community, and we force these groups. But on the other hand, I want to be sympathetic. I believe all these pastors want people to be in a relationship. I believe they know that people's connections and friendships and hobbies shared together help people to engage one another and invest in the church and plug in. So I wouldn't be one who wants to end small groups, but yeah, we led small groups out of our home for years. Tanya and I have attended and joined small groups, and We've met great people. It makes it so when you go to church, you recognize people and can say hi and give them a hug. I guess my struggle that I've had with small groups is that they're can be a wonderful place to meet some new friends. They rarely have a solid discipleship component to them. In other words, cool, wonderful. We're getting together, we're talking about our kids, we're eating a meal, we're having fun. We might do a little Bible study, but usually there's no defined leader who can help people grow deeper in their walk with Christ. It has a great social component, right? I mean, I was saying last night, I'm not against the sociological dimensions of being a Christian. There have been men who became Christians for 2,000 years because they wanted to marry that girl. So that's a sociological dimension. There's probably going to be millions of men in heaven because they said, oh my gosh, I want her. But she's a Christian, and she won't let me marry her unless I become a Christian. And so millions of men become Christians. Anyway, small groups have a great purpose, but how do you make that purpose more authentic? How do you, like you say, not just have it be programized?
Yeah, and that's a really hard question that churches need to wrestle with. And I've been processing my disdain for small groups for a long time now. And I have a couple takeaways. I mean, one, there's a really, really good impetus behind the wanting of small groups in a church. A lot of churches are seeing the value of empowering their members and with their giftings to lead in the church. And for some people, small groups can be that, but that goes wrong when no one is there that really is a gifted teacher or discipler or a leader. That just ends up being the most talkative people talking, and it becomes this simply showing up and feeling the pressure to talk or not talk, and that's the worst of it. But I really, this is the way I feel of it. I just look at how community has happened in my life. We all already have small groups, mostly all of us probably, that we're a part of. And I feel like churches should just encourage us to be intentional with the groups we're already a part of. Those people might not go to the church, but we're already in communities, and being empowered to and told and encouraged to see the value in the communities we have. And I think there's something there just in that. And then if you have people that are being more intentional with the friend groups they already have, like you can work with that. Now you have, again, people that aren't in your church or are, but you have people living out the gospel the way they're meant to, even though you can't measure it and put it on a year-end report.
Yeah, I'm just listening and thinking, oh my gosh, we're so profoundly shaped by culture. And I'm not saying this as to stab in the eye to the church. It's a lament for me. We are so profoundly shaped by culture. When I was a kid growing up in church, we all went to church as families. I knew whole families at church. We had regular potlucks. I knew everybody at the potluck. There was just a societal sense of connection that we don't have anymore. So, I want to show grace for churches doing small groups because they're saying, hey, we're not relational anymore. Society is splintering, and society's making us treat one another all as strangers. So let's do small groups. And it's just this double bind. It's like, how do we program relationship? How do we program authenticity? And it's just, God bless every small group leader out there. God bless everybody who's a part of a small group. How do we do this with authenticity? How do we do this so that it's real and meaningful and engaging? And I'm so glad you brought up this topic because it's probably taboo to even put it on the table, but oh Lord, help us. Who will deliver us from this body of death?
It's good we're playing good cop, bad cop. I'm speaking kind of off the cuff and candidly about this, and it's true. And it's important to say that people, and I callously said that churches do small groups for KPIs. It's true. It's not the whole truth though, and it comes from
Like your dad, you have a callous soul.
I have a callous soul. I have a hardened heart. Yeah, it is a way to try to answer the problem of society in general. Society's decentralized. We don't have things that bring us together like church anymore. People go to the movies less, for crying out loud. So it's totally a valid way to address that issue. But again, I guess the way I'd put it is, I don't think it's the long-term solution to true community and true relationship. I think a lot of people have community and relationship that may or may not be a part of their church already. And I think there's something to be said for investing in people and helping them make the community they already have healthier and more fruitful.
So maybe it's just as simple as, hey, invite your immediate family, your extended family, invite your close friends, make a small group. Let's wrap this up, and we'll make this conversation. And I'm so glad to have you with me, John, and thinking out loud and trying to find solutions. Part of the finding of solutions starts with recognizing what the problems are first. So I've loved having you here today. We'll pick this up in part 2. Thanks so much for joining me.
Awesome. Thanks. Appreciate it. It's a lot of fun. We can maybe have a segment called Good Cop, Bad Cop, where we rip on different issues going forward.
Hey, you're interested in helping the show? Well, there's several easy ways to do that. You can go to YouTube and subscribe to the Uncensored Unprofessor page. You can send a URL feed to a friend on Instagram. You can go to iTunes and rate the show. I'm happy to see those numbers going up on ratings. And you can tell a friend about the podcast. So there's lots of different ways to get involved. You can also subscribe at Patreon, Patreon, where there are different tiered memberships: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, $5, $10, and $20 a month. And for each of those tiers, I give different goodies back. But I'd love to have you partnering with me. Would love to have you part of the team. Well, I hope you found this episode stimulating and provocative, maybe made you think through some things you hadn't considered before. But thanks so much for joining us today. And please turn your brains on, everybody.